and we really want to kind of be on time because we have speakers who leave early tonight, and so we can't really afford to delay too much.
Okay, so welcome to this afternoon session called Negotiating the Boundaries of the Demos, a problem that is both perennial and yet at the same time very contemporary for democracies. We have a small change in the order of speakers than what appears in the program. We will have Larry Lessig first, Bauböck, Bernard Harcourt, and Diana Mutz. I'm just going to introduce the speakers all at once now, rather than interrupting each speaker. So our first speaker is Lawrence Lessig, who is the Roy L. Farman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. And prior to returning to Harvard, he taught at Stanford Law School, where he founded the Center for Internet and Society, and at the University of Chicago. He's a founding member of the Board of Creative Commons, and his books include Republic Lost, 2012, and Republic Lost V2, 2015, among many others, but it's self-understood that I'm just selecting a few. Rainer Bauböck, the second speaker, holds a chair in social and political theory at the European University Institute and was actually dean of the Division of the Social Sciences there for quite some time. He also was a visiting professor some years ago in ethics, politics, and economics at Yale. Rainer is a leading thinker on issues of democratic citizenship, European integration, migration, and his most recent publication is a very fascinating discussion also with a lead essay by Rainer. The book is called Democratic Inclusion, Rainer Bauböck in Dialogue, from Manchester University Press, Critical Powers. Bernard Harcourt is Isidore and Sibylle Sulzbacher Professor of Law and Political Science at Columbia University. Newly Executive Director of the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and also Founding Director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, and always generates a lot of work for me at the center, which I'm delighted to participate in. His scholarship intersects social and political theory, sociology of punishment, and I should also mention that he's a very important death penalty or attorney, litigation, and Bernard's last book, Exposed, Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, became very important for discussions of digitalization and loss of freedom and democratic procedure. And his new book is The Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens, to appear sometime later this spring. Finally, Diane C. Mutz is Samuel Stauffer Professor of Political Science and Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, and also Director of the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics at the Edinburgh Public Policy Center. She has written many award-winning books, but one that I will mention, which was also quite influential for me, is Hearing the Other Side, Deliberative versus Participatory Democracy, published in 2006, which won both the Goldsmith Prize by Harvard University and the Robert Lane Prize in Political Psychology of the American Political Science Association. So, welcome to you all, and I probably will not be as exact, or I should be, as David Gray will, but you know the timing, so, okay, Larry.
So thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, in particular to be part of a conversation that has recurred so often to the idea of mini publics or sortition, which, as you'll see, I'm motivating a discussion in favor of these ideas, but from a different perspective. And the context which triggered this approach was actually a dinner that I don't know if I had the privilege, but I was certainly among the privileged, to attend in Aspen. So I had given a talk, and then a billionaire asked me to come to dinner at his house, and there were at least 2 billionaires, a United States senator, a person who was considering running for president, that wasn't me, and a bunch of other elites. And by the dessert course, the general consensus and direction of the conversation was how we had to find a way to move beyond democracy in America. These were the elites rallying the idea that democracy had failed in America. We had to find a different model, and that the people were perpetually embarrassing to the very idea of what democracy could be. And so that's the starting point I want to try to find a way to push against. And I want to do that by triggering intuitions I'm sure all of you will share through a story about a made-up place that I'm going to call Jury, Alaska. So imagine there's a place, Jury, Alaska, which in the late 1800s is founded. It's a very small place, and when it's founded, they adopt a very unique rule, which is every criminal and civil trial will have a jury, and the jury will be composed of every citizen of Jury, Alaska. And so for the first 20 years, this works in the way you might expect, a small number of people. They all come down to a courthouse, they hear the cases, they then deliberate, and then they vote. But then, the turn of the century, Jury, Alaska discovers oil. And so the population explodes. But the presupposition of the way civil and criminal trials will happen doesn't change. Instead, they are all, as citizens of Jury, Alaska, expected to participate in the decisions for every single trial. They facilitate this by putting technology in everybody's house to enable them to listen early on, and then eventually computer technology so they can watch early on. But we all, as citizens of Jury, Alaska, have this duty to commit ourselves to the judgments, very serious judgments in cases of criminal trials. This is a place that likes John's idea of executing people, so people could be executed in these criminal trials, and everybody has this obligation to participate. Now, you can imagine coming to Jury, Alaska and observing what we all know what would happen, and that is that people cannot really commit the time necessary to understand the facts or the circumstances of these trials, and so their judgments are impaired. And you can imagine coming to jury and saying to jury, hey, look, why don't you guys just pick a random number of people to get together and judge particular cases? Instead of everybody having this obligation, just identify a small set. And there might be a pushback from this. The pushback might be you're denying the basic democratic character of being a citizen of Jury, Alaska. But I think all of us have an intuition of what that crude sense of democratic is missing. And I think the thing that I want to force into the foreground is a recognition of the way in which we understand institutions to speak. In this sense, we understand a jury speaks, but it speaks in our tradition, not in Jury Alaska's tradition, if and only if it's properly constituted. And we regulate the conditions of its speech. We regulate what properly constituted means. And if it speaks outside of that structure, then what we say is that it's not the jury's speech that we are hearing. If we interrupted them midway through deliberations and we took a poll and said, well, 70% now support conviction, that's interesting, but that's not the jury. That's not the jury speaking. Now, this sense of regulating the conditions on which institutions speak is true not just of juries. Stephen Breyer's a very smart guy, but you wouldn't think of running into him on the street and quizzing him on admiralty law, or indeed quizzing 6 members of the court on admiralty law. What we understand is the court speaks after hearing arguments, reading briefs, deliberating among each other, and then forming an opinion, which is the structure of their decision and the way in which they utter it. The same thing with the president, or it used to be true of the president. The president deliberates or is informed in the context of making a judgment, and the structure of his speech, whether it's through an executive order or through some official policy paper, is highly regulated. Same thing with Congress. The Congress speaks, it speaks through law. The boundaries of this rule can, of course, be contested. The fight in American law about the role of legislative history is a fight about whether we can understand Congress to be speaking in any way other than through bicameralism and presentment. And of course, people like Scalia say no, the legislature doesn't speak except through laws. And those who support the idea of looking to legislative history say, well, we understand something of what they're trying to say in things like official reports. Now, my point is, this is all contested, but it's contested within a frame. And here's the frame. The frame is some speech of institutions is just not the speech of those institutions. That's the intuition I want you to start with. Okay, so then how do we, the people, speak? And to think about that, I want to take two things and keep them very far apart. So here's thing one, thing two. So thing one and thing two are these. Thing one is think about how they, meaning the people, know something. And thing two is how they, the people, speak. And I want to, just to push these intuitions, think about this in three different contexts. We can think first of like all of the 19th century. What I'm going to say is true of all of the 19th century. And then we could think what I'm going to say is true of at least a slice of the 20th century. And then I'm going to say something which I think is true of all of the 21st century, at least so far. So let's start with the 19th century, and we start with thing one. How did they know? And what they know is that what we know is that they knew through an extraordinary range of sources. There's no broadcasting in the 19th century. There are hundreds of sources, meaning it's a highly fragmented and diverse source of knowledge, which means common knowledge about at least public matters is relatively thin. Okay, so that's thing one. But thing two then says, so how do they speak? In one way they speak is through elections, but the elections are the only way that we understand them to be speaking. There's no polling in the 19th century. There are efforts by people to interpret what we, the people, or what the people believe, but this is more like a Catholic priest interpreting the Latin Bible for his parishioners. It's a way of understanding, but there's no direct access to the Word of God, or in our democracy, to the Word of the people. And what that means is that the will of the people is relatively invisible, and policymaking is policymaking by an elite. So if you imagine some naive soul standing up and saying, what does the public want? The appropriate response in the 19th century is something like this. Okay, this is thing one, thing two in the 19th century. Then I'm going to think about at least 25 years of the 20th century. And I'm going to say we should reflect on two massive technological changes that are going to affect both thing one and thing two. One of these technological changes affects thing one, and that is the emergence of broadcasting. The technology to facilitate many listening to something at one time. And there's an especially significant role in this story of broadcasting in the sense of television. I'm going to say roughly 55 through 1980. And I'm following here the work of the great Marcus Pryor of Princeton, who in his extraordinary work, Post-Broadcast Democracy, really gives us an empirical understanding of the way television changed everything. Right, so not just because of the concentration that television had in exposing people to news. So even as late as 77, 90% of people said they got their news from 3 television network news shows. But also in the addiction it facilitated. This technology was irresistible to people in their house. Yet because it was video, it would render news in an understandable way for a very wide range of the public. And therefore, it was extremely egalitarian relative to the understanding in the 19th century, which means more citizens were engaged in mainstream and at that time trusted sources of information. And that means the common understanding here for many of these issues is relatively thick. Okay, so that's the thing affecting thing one. And then there's a technological change that affects thing two, namely how do they, the people, speak. In the 20th century, throughout most of the 20th century, They speak with elections, but the second really critical technical change here is given to us by George Gallup. That's the emergence of polling. And so what polling is a practical way for the people to speak about issues of public policy. Of course, theorists had thought about this for a long time. This has been a dream of theirs for democracy. James Bryce described a final stage in the evolution of democracy would be reached if the will of the majority of the citizens were to become ascertainable at all times. This idea, of course, is what George Gallup thought that he would provide. But the thing to recognize is because of the particular architecture of information during this period, it was a very special public that we were beginning to poll. So common knowledge was relatively thick, meaning it was a respectable public we were beginning to poll, a normatively significant public. Then began to be our understanding of who we were listening to through these polls. You say something like 70% of the public believes, that matters democratically. Okay, so that's thing one. Thing two, in the 20th century, now think a little bit about the 21st century, where one massive technological change is at the center of our current world, and that change is the internet, which means that broadcasting is dead. Now we have literally thousands of sources that people can tune into to get access to their information. It's a really great thing for culture. Think about Game of Thrones, or better yet, Better Call Saul. I mean, Fukuyama had the idea of the end of history with respect to political theory, but obviously with respect to culture, there's nothing ever that will exceed the Better Call Saul, right? So it's a great thing for culture, but it's a really terrible thing for democracy. Because what it does is fragment a public, which means a diffuse public, which means no common story, which means an ignorant public. By which I don't mean a stupid public. I mean an ignorant public, which doesn't have the basis upon which to make the judgment it needs to make. Well, you might say, well, then it's just back to the 19th century. But this is not the 19th century. In the 19th century, the people were silent. In the 21st century, the people can't stop blathering. The blather is measured. This is what my billionaire friends were watching. But it's still presumptively normatively relevant, but it's relevant and embarrassing. All right, so this leads to the final point. So I think that point one and point two, point one about how we structure how institutions speak, and point two about how we as a people have evolved an unstructured way to speak, means that we need to find ways to regulate how we the people speak. Now, regulate here does not mean we could ban polls. That would be another unconstitutional thing to say, just like executing people for violating financial rules would be an unconstitutional rule in the American Republic. But I'm not saying we ban polls, but we have to find ways to complement polls. And the obvious way are the ways that have been discussed through the course of this conference: mini publics, deliberative fora, deliberative polls, techniques to complement an unavoidably ignorant public view with less ignorant public view. Maybe even, we might hope, sensible public view about at least certain critical public matters that might give the public, and especially the elite, the sense that maybe we're not so stupid after all. Okay, that's all I have.
This is really a hard act to follow up on. I also have a PowerPoint. That's this and I speak on the same topic, at least towards the end. But otherwise, I think it might be quite different. So, while this is being uploaded, let me just say that like all of the people in this room, I've just finished this book that Sheila mentioned. And when I got the invitation from Sheila and Ellen to this conference, I was in a state of postnatal depression, as many of you might have experienced. You've done something, you think you've made a coherent argument, and then you start to think, what have I forgotten? You know, is there something that I haven't considered really? You know, how can I take this beyond the argument that I've just made? And this is what I will be trying to do. So the argument that I made in this book was fairly a classic normative kind of half liberal, half Republican argument, how states should determine who their citizens are, not just states, but all types of democratic polities, and who should be enfranchised. And it was even to a certain extent prescriptive. But I said at the very beginning of the book, you have to assume certain presuppositions before you can get started in talking about democracy as we know it. And I hinted at the possibility that some of these presuppositions might change. You know, there might be things that happen and upset them, and then we have to think anew about what democracy is, but I don't know what it will be in the end. So a little bit along the lines of Eve. There might be change on the way, and normative theorists usually stick to their rigid, fixed presuppositions and don't consider social change. Thinking about social change drives me almost into the camp of critical theory. Which is not entirely my natural inclination. But this is what it will be. So let me just say that in this essay, I say that democracy relies on certain ahistorical circumstances of democracy. I borrow this from Rawls's idea of circumstances of justice, and historical context of democracy. So the historical contexts are the things that may change. The historical circumstances are the things that are more or less taken for given, because they are those things that make democracy normatively necessary and empirically possible in the first place. And what I suggest that this includes is a diversity of interests, identities, and ideas or ideologies inside the polity. You don't need democracy if everybody has exactly the same interests and ideas and views. And secondly, an external similar diversity between different polities that have to face other polities in their environment. So that's the idea. Maybe a world state that is not subdivided into very strong autonomous polities would not be democratic because it doesn't have an outside that you can relate to. So what are the historical contexts that have changed over time, but that we tend to take for granted? This is that most jurisdiction is territorial. It's exercised over territories and people who happen to be in those territories. The non-territorial forms of jurisdiction are just marginal to these territorial foundations. And secondly, we tend to assume that people are kind of relatively sedentary, relatively to these territorial boundaries. So within the boundaries of nation states, the majority of people spend most of their lives within these boundaries. And then I am raising this what-if question if that no longer applies. This is what I call a dystopian hypothetical scenario of hypermobile societies. What if big majorities of people spend most of their lives outside the boundaries of the entity whose citizens they are, and most of the people living inside that entity are not citizens of that entity? How would we then think about democracy and holding government accountable that rules over these territories? And it's an open question. So, and I conjure this up as a counterfactual scenario in order to defend the relevance, the normative relevance of territory, and to explain why migrants basically have claims to integrate rather than the other way around, the sedentary majorities integrating into hypermobile majorities. But then now I start to think maybe things are actually shifting, and these historical presuppositions are no longer taken for granted. So actual social change may be happening through globalization and the digital revolution that Larry just talked about, because historically stable contexts disintegrate, and that might eventually also affect the circumstances under which democracy is necessary and possible, because it might lead us into societies that are internally rather homogeneous and externally so different from each other that the circumstances also no longer clearly apply, and then post-democracy might not be a completely outlandish scenario, also I think a deeply undesirable one. So let me talk about the standard model before I come to the 4 challenges that we currently face. Citizenship from the inside relies on a differentiation between a sphere of non-territorial voluntary associations, aka civil society, and a sphere of territorial, non-voluntary associations that we might call political society. The structural principles around which these two spheres are organized are entirely different in that sense. My claim is that, well, I come to that on the next slide, but the distinction between these two spheres is virtuous in a way for democracy because it allows citizens to affirm and pursue diverse interests, identities, and ideologies in association with similar and like-minded individuals in civil society, while at the same time binding them together with dissimilar others as equal members of self-governing territorial politics. So you get both of these worlds combined, and how are they combined? Through the public spheres that Larry just talked about. There is a public sphere that mediates between the political society and the civil society sphere. Now, from the outside, citizenship is something like a sorting mechanism. It sorts individuals into associations of a political kind. So generally, sorting out individuals into associations can be done by individual choice. Then you get voluntary associations, by sortition, randomly, through lottery, or through tracing the links that these people have to specific associations. And my claim is that in a plurality of territorially nested polities, the world in which we currently live, membership allocation has to trace genuine links using different mechanisms for that, instead of relying on voluntary choice or sortition. You cannot construct political community either based on voluntary choice or on sortition. Tracing genuine links can be done in different ways. The standard way how it's done by the states is through birthright. You get a citizenship assigned by birth, through descent, through birth in the territory, and you keep it by default for the rest of your life until circumstances arise under which you might want to change it because you have emigrated. A second mechanism is through residence. And my claim is at the local level, local citizenship ought to be based, and de facto, to a large extent, is based on an entirely different principle, which is the principle of jus domicilii. It is based on residence. You become a citizen of a municipality just because you take up residence there, and it also means you lose it the moment you leave the territory of that municipality. Thirdly, it can be based on derivation. I'm a citizen of the Union because I'm a national of Austria. Most of you will be citizens of the state of the US because you are a citizen of the Federation. So that's the derivative mechanisms. None of these three mechanisms relies on either voluntary choice or on sortition. It's determined. You are thrown together with other people through these mechanisms without your choice. And that being thrown together creates the plurality within the polity that you cannot get if you base the same sortition on voluntary choice. So I'll skip the rest of this to come to the four challenges that I see. How could this be upset in a future world? The first challenge, I think, is already very much with us. This is what I call the mobility cleavage. So political scientists that study opinion polls have tried to have identified a new type of cleavage that is no longer on the left-right axis, but that is on an open-closed axis. People are more cosmopolitan or more parochial, and very often that doesn't entirely match with the left-right axis, but it might be even orthogonal to it. So this is not just an attitudinal question. So my assumption is, and I think, and I hope it could be confirmed by some of the empiricists here, it actually corresponds to behavioral patterns. And the behavioral patterns might have something to do with mobility. Mobility in the geographic sense, of course, people who actually travel to other places in order to find jobs or partners or experience a different culture and lifestyle, but also cognitive forms of mobility. You can imagine yourself in another place. You seek information about other places outside your territorial polity. This is what makes people mobile, and it makes them feel they have a political space that is much larger than whatever the polity is they have been thrown into. Right? On the other hand, you have relatively immobile populations, and this has been discussed a lot at this conference, that have an experience of shrinking political spaces. Their life worlds have become narrow over time. They feel no longer they share the same political space even within the nation state with all the other citizens. And that discrepancy of experience is exploited by populists. We have been using that term a lot, but I think there is such a phenomenon that you can see populist leaders capturing the immobile populations in order to mobilize them as counter movements against what they see the established elites. So the problem is, if you are faced with a left-right divide within a well-defined and demarcated territory, you can think about how, 3 minutes, okay, you can think about how to accommodating this because it's the same space. If you have discrepant spaces, the problem is, what's the mechanism for bridging that type of cleavage? So the second, I have only 3 more minutes left, I'll probably skip this second point entirely, which is about the increasing instrumental uses of citizenship so that they no longer trace the genuine links that are essential for what citizenship serves for in the international system of states. And I'll come to the third challenge that was also brought up by Isabel's talk, which is a new type of economy that is no longer like the industrial economy. I'm referring here to the book and panel lectures by Elizabeth Anderson that I think is very much in line with what Isabel said. The idea that there is private forms of government that is unaccountable and non-democratic inside our societies, and it dominates the lives of so many people who are workers and exposed to that private government. But that's very explicitly in her account a result of the Industrial Revolution. Let us think through what the digital revolution might mean, and it might have just as big an impact on society as the Industrial Revolution has had. And one of the impacts might be that firms depend much less on workers, on workforces. Instead, they depend on individual users providing them with data. So are there new forms of exploitation and domination that have something to do with that exploitation of individual data that these people use in order to create new form of monopolies through network effects? That's at least a question worth asking. So what are the counter-domination strategies against this potential domination in the digital economy? Individual exit options or collective consumer action, boycott. I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, but I don't think it makes a difference for Facebook or Twitter. So not very likely to be effective. Secondly, supranational regulation. The EU is actually quite good at this, going after Google, going after Amazon, and imposing regulations because that's a big market. No nation state in Europe would have the power to pull this off. The EU has the power to do something about this. But that doesn't address the structural question of the domination that is exercised inside the spheres created by these digital giants and their users. There are billions of users out there. So the third answer would be, how can we democratize that sphere, the relation between the digital company and the users? And there are people who think about this and think about democratic alternative forms of building democratic fora and communities on the internet based on blockchain that can neither be controlled by corporations or by governments. And then they think this may be new forms of political community. So why can't we build, governments inside these cloud communities that will actually be authorized by their citizens who are members of the cloud community, who are willing to pay taxes for the services that they receive. So my problem with this is that's based on the sortition mechanism of voluntary association and individual choice. So these cloud communities will be internally homogeneous because people sort themselves out to be like the others. And externally, they will be entirely different. They will have completely different purposes. And they will coexist in the same territories. And my worry is that's a rather dystopian vision of democracy, because what's left then is the question, how will these cloud communities relate to each other, and who will be the democratic sovereign that kind of can regulate how they relate to each other? So just to stimulate you, we've just started a debate on this question on the Global Citizenship Observatory, and I hope that many of you will volunteer to provide inputs for that. And the clouds there, it looks like the sun is rising, which is what my co-editor thinks it does, but I think also it may be a upcoming thunderstorm.
All right. Thank you. So I'll be the humanist in the room this afternoon, perhaps, and somewhat like Voltaire, or at least as Candide had learned by the end of his journeys, as he had learned one must tend to one's own garden. I'll focus on the United States. And what I'd like to do in the short time I have with you is propose one distinction, one metaphor, and one literary text for a discussion on the boundaries of the demos. Now, my starting point is pretty conventional. We've all known, and we've known for a long time, that democracies and borders were twins at birth. That democracies have depended on exclusion. The Athenian democracy was, we all know, a patriarchal regime that excluded women and slaves. Our American democracy was created for propertied white males. The Rousseauian ideal was of a small, tight-knit community. From antiquity, the concept of democracy was traditionally accompanied by a limited concept of citizenship and membership. And still today, many, if not most, long-established democratic societies continue to restrict membership. The closed borders of Western democracies were in sharp relief during the most recent ongoing crisis of migration caused by the Syrian civil war and the turmoils in North Africa. And the European debates and the national conflicts that arose reflected the different ways that the old countries dealt with these waves of migrants, influenced in part, the differences that is, by the legacy of mid-20th century history, I think. And in part, the refusal of many Western democracies to really pitch in and generously open their borders was excused or softened in some way, or rendered less intolerable to us, precisely because of the shared sentiment, a somewhat shared sentiment, that social democracies, democracies with stronger social welfare systems, with universal health care and a social net, just can't provide for everyone. Right? You just can't provide health care for every person coming into the country. That these democracies, in some sense, need borders or else they will fail, will go bankrupt, or they'll veer right. Or at the very least, that they need to go slowly and integrate immigrants in a reasonable manner. Now, those forms of justification that serve to render borders more palatable, even on the left, I think, depend, and here's the distinction, depend on a notion of an older demos. In some sense, depend on a notion of where you started, which was with this idea of a kind of sedentary demos. And so this is the first distinction I propose. The United States was, of all Western countries, perhaps the least generous and the most stingy in accepting refugees during the Syrian crisis. But what made our actions so ethically problematic, I would argue, is not just the extent of our indifference to the plight of these refugees, but the fact that, by contrast to most other democracies, our country is a land of immigrants. Settlers and immigrants predominantly. Others forced and kidnapped persons brought here. But migrants predominantly, who displaced Native Americans violently. And that distinction, it seems, is important. It's the distinction between an old democracy, or a notion of a demos, and, on the other hand, a democratic land of immigrants. Now, I'd argue that something fundamentally different happens when a modern liberal democracy composed predominantly of immigrants, and predominantly so because the immigrants in large part exterminated the native populations and forcibly brought enslaved populations to the country. But a democracy composed predominantly of immigrants, something different happens when it decides to close its borders. The act is infinitely less defensible and becomes internally corrosive. Ethically, politically, it transforms the democracy into a collection of thankless, selfless, selfish, if only selfless, thankless, selfish people who put their own safety first. Because in truth, the only difference between those inside and those trying to come inside is that the first got there first, right? Now, based on that distinction, the question becomes then what happens ethically and politically to a democracy made of immigrants when they close the doors to other immigrants? And so here is where I'd like to propose the metaphor. And the metaphor is a vessel at sea. And the people on this vessel are castaways at sea, who are basically in the act of kind of pushing off the people who are clutching to the side of the vessel, right? I mean, they've gotten on the vessel, they're saving themselves, and all that they can imagine to do is to kind of knock the hands off of the sides of this ship and allow the others to drown. Now we should think here not of a small lifeboat that will capsize if too many people get on. No, the metaphor is more of a spacious vessel that's not really at risk of capsizing from those at sea. There's plenty of room on this vessel at sea. There's plenty of wealth to go around. In fact, so much so that 3 of the most wealthy men on that vessel together have as much space for them as 50% of the rest of the people, right? More than 150 million people, right, have one spot, and 3 men have the other equal amount on this vessel. 100 of these people have as much space on this vessel as all 42 million African Americans on the vessel, right? So there's plenty of space on the vessel. It's not as if it's going to tip or capsize if it took on a few more persons trying to save themselves. Yet the vessel is full of castaways knocking the hands off others who are drowning at sea. Now that's the metaphor then. And somehow I want to suggest that it's very corrosive somehow, internally. It delegitimizes the entire enterprise of making these citizens, and it makes these citizens appear what they are in some sense, ungrateful and selfish. All of us whose names are not the same as our parents, right? Or grandparents. It's worse somehow, of course, when the person who owes their existence to their immigration, or that of their parents or grandfathers or grandparents, turns a blind eye to the needs of other immigrants. And I'm not suggesting that this is not common. It is very common. But the analogy to me is somewhat like a moment in the Battle of Algiers. You remember, when it becomes clear that so many of the French officers who practiced torture on the suspected FLN members or sympathizers had themselves been subject of torture at the hands of the Gestapo, right? And it's that moment when you think to yourself, how could that possibly be, right? If you had yourself been the victim of torture at the hands of Gestapo, how would it possibly be that you would be the one administering this torture? And it underscored, and that is somehow embedded in this metaphor and in the injustice of this metaphor. I saw it firsthand in this case that I brought last year, at about exactly this time last year on January 30th, when President Trump had signed the Muslim ban. There's a young Syrian doctor who had been excluded. We were able to finally bring him back. He was on a J1 visa. He was in the UAE. We finally brought him back. And when we reunited him at Mercy Hospital, where he was working, teaching, it was clear that everyone there were immigrants. His uncle was the head of the unit, which is how he got that J1 visa, was the head of the unit at Mercy Hospital, right? His cousin was in the unit as well. Everyone who came to welcome him, they were all foreign-trained young doctors who had immigrated. So very quickly, since I'm running out of time, the last thing I was going to propose then was one literary text, and here it's a question of what happens on this closed vessel, right? When the corrosion kicks in from this act of kind of selfishness, and somehow I think that the risk here is the Lord of the Flies story, right? Of an enclosed community, right, that begins to turn on itself. And that's effectively, I think, one of the things that is plaguing the country is this turning in on itself. I refer to it as kind of a domestication of the counterinsurgency war paradigm, which we've used abroad, but that we're bringing in on ourselves. And what I'd suggest is it has been going on for a while. It's not new. It's not a Trump phenomenon. This domestication of the counterinsurgency has been going on at least since 9/11. All right, I have one more minute, actually. So let me just say quickly that I was going to start, but I decided not to, but now I'm going to end this way, by this counterfactual of how would we be feeling about democracy today, counterfactually, if Hillary Clinton had won the Electoral College? Right. And so that was how I did want to. I had originally wanted to start there because I think that there would be a different sentiment about where this country is if Hillary Clinton had won the. And what I think that what that counterfactual suggests, of course, is that these questions need to be looked at in a longer review. All right. Thank you very much.